Welcome to the third presentation of the symposium this afternoon. And after, I know it is late, it's going to be late afternoon, but after that there's going to be a lovely reception, so there's something to look forward to, right? But before that, I'm going to invite my colleague, Professor Ji-Won Huang, to introduce our third speaker. Professor Ji-Won Huang is an assistant professor with expertise in experimental linguistics, psycholinguistics, cognitive linguistics, language education. She is a top-notch, she asked me to be brief, I cannot be brief here. She's a top-notch researcher that you heard about the grants that we have received by the MIC Center in the past decade, and Ji-Won has served as PI of some of the major grants that we have gotten in the last 10 years. And she's also the director of Asian languages at Stony Brook University. So let us welcome Professor Ji-Won Huang.
Welcome everyone to today's last talk, and I am distinctively honored to introduce our guest speaker, Professor Antonella Sorace. I may not be able to give a personal introduction for Antonella as Loredana did this morning because this is our first time to meet here, but I have to say that as I was preparing for this introduction and reading more about her work, I actually felt pretty deep personal connection to her, without her knowing that, of course, because of the work that she does and the messages that it delivers to me as at a very personal level. So I'm pretty sure that many of you here would probably feel the same way after her talk today. Antonella Sorace holds positions as Professor of Developmental Linguistics at the University of Edinburgh and Honorary Professor at University College London. Her scholarly excellence and contributions have been recognized with prestigious honors and fellowships, including the British Academy, the Royal Societies of Edinburgh, and the American Association for Advancement of Science, to name just a few. Professor Sorace is a distinguished authority in the field of bilingualism. She's globally known for her comprehensive research that bridges linguistics, experimental psychology, and cognitive science. Her work addresses critical questions across these disciplines, focusing on topics such as bilingualism over the lifespan, native language attrition, which you will hear about today, focusing on bilingual language acquisition in early and late childhood, and the effects of bilingualism on cognitive processes. She's also renowned for her contribution to language psychology and for pioneering the use of magnitude estimation experimental linguistics, a crucial method for assessing linguistic acceptability. Her work extends beyond linguistics into vital public engagement. As the founding director of Bilingualism Matters, a non-profit organization dedicated to broadening public understanding of bilingualism, she actively and impactfully promotes the benefits of bilingual education and multilingualism across a global network. In this role, she has given more than 800 general audience talks, events, and media interviews, so we are indeed very, very fortunate to have her here with us today. Now, we are eager to listen to her insights from her extensive research on the ecology of second language learning and first language change in bilingualism. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Professor Antonella.
Thank you so much for this wonderful introduction, and thank you for the invitation. I'm really, really delighted to be here and to meet as many of you as possible in a very short time. I'm here only for 2.5 days. My talk is probably going to be a little bit more boring than the previous ones. I'm really going to focus on research. Not in the details, but I'm going to focus on what is emerging from one of the areas of research in which we are engaged, which is language attrition, bad term, bad word, you know, I'm going to say something about that very soon. And I won't have time to talk about the political and social implications of what I'm going to say, but I hope that this will emerge from what I'm saying. And I'm not sure whether we'll have time to discuss them after the talk, but it would be nice to hear back from you, even by email. You know, please feel free to get in touch with comments, criticisms, you know, any observation that you feel is appropriate. Because my philosophy is, as some of you know, the more of us who work together, the better the research, the better the impact that we have on society. So please, you know, let's keep in touch. So there are some open questions. You know, one is the one that I'm going to focus on. And this is how the native language of second language speakers actually changes, focusing in particular on first generation speakers. I'm a first generation migrant. I'm Italian. I left Italy. I moved to the UK. We'll see, you know, how my language has changed. Okay, and what can change as a result of learning another language. There are two related questions that I won't have time to deal with in detail. One is, if my Italian has changed, what about the Italian learned by my children? So my children grew up bilingual with English and Italian, but obviously the Italian they heard, particularly from me, was not the same Italian that I heard when I was growing up in Italy, the country where I was born. So what's the implication of, you know, the changes in my native language on to the next generation, second generation heritage speakers? And ultimately, is there a connection between second language learning and first language change? So, you know, we know that lively languages change over time. If a language doesn't change anymore, it's dead. And I'll come back to this, you know, this is a crucial issue for the maintenance of many minority languages. As some of you said before, minority languages are disappearing at the very, very fast rate because they're not spoken to the next generation and then to the next generation. How many generations can a language skip before it disappears? Not very many, as we know. So we need to understand, you know, whether this attrition phenomena contribute to diachronic change over time, and I think they do, and we have to accept that. But we'll see, perhaps, politically, this is a very controversial question, okay? But we may come back to this. So, the main point is learning a second language actually changes your language, your native language. Is this surprising? I hope not. It's not surprising for many of you. So, we're talking about, again, first generation speakers who have a first language, maybe not only one. Many of us, you know, I grew up with Italian as my main language, and Sardinian, which is a minority language spoken in Italy, in the background, because my mother spoke it, but not with me, because of the usual prejudices. You know, Sardinian is useless as a language. What's the point of passing it on? Right. There may be one more, you know, more than one first language learned from birth, and then a second language learned as an adult. This is the population that I'm going to focus on in particular today. Now, I can see that there are boxes missing in this slide. You know, they are, you can imagine them, right? So, first language box, second language box, it should be, and then you have acquisition and attrition. And one of the questions that we face in our research, particularly in Edinburgh, but also in other places, is whether there is an ecology of second language acquisition and first language attrition. So, the two phenomena are intimately connected, and in fact, They may be functionally connected in the way that attrition, changes in the first language are functional to becoming proficiently bilingual in a second language. Attrition is a bad word, as I said at the beginning, and in fact, in early research on attrition, it had negative connotations. These are quotes from research from as far as 1991, so we're not talking about a century ago, we're talking about 30 plus years ago. So bilingualism is a natural setting for the unraveling of native language abilities. How strong is that? Or attrition, this is even better, is the disintegration of the structure of a first language in contact situations with the second language. So how more negative than this can you be? So clearly, and part of the reason for the use of this terminology is that early research was focused on migrants who had left their original countries for need. They had emigrated, for example, from Europe to the United States, and at that point, a century ago, there was no internet, no social media, no cheap flights. So it was really, breaking up completely with the original country and the original language. Okay, that still doesn't justify, those terms, but you can understand them in context, in the context of early research. So language change comes about because speakers leave their country and their language community. This is the classic case. I'm not saying that it comes about only in this situation, but this is the situation I'm going to focus on. Obviously, they hear less input in their native language, right? Because they're not they don't have a community. They may have a migrant community, which is interesting. We'll come back to this. But they don't have the original community, so typically they hear less input in their L1. And that means reduced exposure to input, but also, we were talking with some of you earlier, to variation, natural variation among speakers. So we speak in different ways. In communities, and it's natural to speak in different ways for a variety of reasons. And that variation is functional to first language acquisition. So, we learn a language when we are exposed to different ways of speaking it, which is a natural, absolutely natural way. And it's not so common in acquiring a heritage language, particularly, when a child hears the heritage language only from mommy or from daddy, but not from other people. And there are phenomena of priming and alignment. These are sort of technical terms that are studied in cognitive psychology, and that means that when people interact with each other, let's put it bluntly, they tend to copy each other in particular ways. So, if I'm a migrant Italian, right? If I speak to other Italians who are also migrant in the UK, and if my language has changed, and theirs has changed too, at different stages, we tend to align with each other. So that kind of alignment or priming tends to reinforce the changes or move them in one particular direction or in the other. And then, as I said, generational attrition, which is not what I'm going to focus on, that means that heritage speakers learn the language mostly from attrited speakers, maybe not only from attrited speakers. As I said, now it's easier to go back to the original country. It's easier to keep in touch, with people who haven't moved from the original country. But that means that there are intergenerational changes. So attrited speakers, let's use this bad word, for the sake of simplicity, provide input to their children, to the heritage speakers, and now, depending on how much input the children the heritage children here, they may actually regularizing the variation. We'll see that there is more variation as a result of these changes. So children may actually regularize the variation. Children are very good at doing this if they hear the input in sufficient quantity. And that means that, that's one possibility that, might lead to the beginning of grammatical changes over time. Because then, if they then decide to speak the same language to their children when the time comes, then, this process will continue. If, on the other hand, heritage speakers don't receive enough input, they receive less and less input, maybe there is a threshold that we don't fully understand, below which, it's really too late. Input from fewer and fewer speakers, less exposure to variation, then children stop acquiring the language. And we heard about this, and the language might die if it's a minority language, and more languages are dying this way. So let's go back to first generation, which is our main focus. So, we'll see that an interesting phenomenon when we study different populations. So first generation native speakers who are migrant to another community and who are experiencing attrition, but also second language speakers of the same language who reach a fairly high level of competence in that language. And what we see, interestingly, is a convergence. So we see that, the attrited speakers, bad word, and the advanced second language speakers of the same language tend to converge, but not randomly. They tend to converge to show similar behavior for particular structures, we'll give you examples soon, interfacing with pragmatics, interfacing with context. And this applies to both similar languages, we'll see, so when the L1 and the L2 are similar, but also when they're different. So it's selective changes that we're talking about, and a convergence between these two populations. So which aspects of language become variable in native speakers of a language or remain variable in non-native speakers of a language at a high level of proficiency? My dear friend and colleague Colin Phillips and colleagues call these complex contingencies. So language phenomena that involve the integration of information across multiple levels of encoding. We'll give you examples. So we'll see that these phenomena are the more vulnerable to attrition. They are more vulnerable to remaining variation in second language learning because they require the integration of linguistic and non-linguistic factors. I'm all in favor of interdisciplinarity in research. We have to talk to one another. We have to stop, working in silos, competing, oh, I only do linguistics. You only do psychology. You only do sociology. We have to pull things together in order to understand phenomena better. So, examples of these phenomena that show a convergence, pronominal references, and this is what I'm going to focus on mostly, gender marking, and also split intransitivity. Don't worry, I'm not going to talk about split intransitivity today, but if you're interested, I can give you more references. So, late bilingual speakers of null subject languages. Null subject languages are languages that allow a choice of pronominal forms. You can either drop a pronoun, so a null subject, or you can use an overt pronoun. So Italian is a classic example of null subject language, but Greek is another, Spanish is another. There are many null subject languages, including Chinese. I'll come back to Chinese, to Mandarin Chinese. So native speakers of these languages that allow a choice between overt and null subjects, when they experience attrition, but also advanced non-native speakers of the same languages, we have the data, they tend to overuse the overt subject form in context where you would expect to drop a subject. but not the other way around. So it's interesting that they don't use pronouns randomly, right? I mean, total confusion. No, there is an asymmetric extension of the overt form to contexts in which you would expect a null form. Remember that we're not talking about violent ungrammaticality here, right? We're talking about appropriateness, you know, of a form in context. So both these populations do this, but they do so to different degrees. So non-native speakers do it more than native speakers experiencing attrition, but we see this convergence. So examples, a sentence like Paola ha salutato sua madre quando null è uscita. That means Paola greeted her mother when null went out. So who went out? Okay, so both antecedents are feminine, singular. So what's the favorite interpretation? Well, the natural division of labor between these pronouns is that the null pronoun tend to refer to the subject antecedent, right? So the natural interpretation would be that Paola went out. Okay, so whereas if the same sentence with an overt pronoun, so Paola ha salutato sua madre quando lei è uscita, without a particular stress on lei, just quando lei è uscita, the favorite interpretation would be that lei refers to the known subject, so her mother, in that sentence. Okay, so that's a classic division of labor in a null subject, language. As I said, you know, there is a tendency in Italians under attrition, like myself, to overuse, overinterpret the overt subject, both in production and in comprehension. So to extend the scope of the overt subject in context in which you would expect a null. In Mandarin Chinese, this is work that we are doing together with a very good PhD student of mine, and we hope to publish these results soon. There is a bias for both null and overt, a subject bias for both null and overt pronouns in comprehension. But null pronouns have a stronger bias than overt pronouns towards the subject. So, you know, there is, you know, they're not absolutely identical to a language like Italian, you know, but there is, again, you know, a tendency for the null pronoun to prefer the subject antecedent, like in Italian or Spanish and Greek. This is an experiment that we did, and we did experiments with a control group of speakers of mainland Chinese in China, right? So they had not traveled abroad and so on. Then first experimental group with a shorter term of exposure to English, so people who were doing a master's degree in the UK, who had been in Edinburgh for, you know, about a year maximum. And then the second experimental group with a longer term exposure to English, and these were usually PhD researchers. They had spent, you know, more than a year and so on. So longer exposure to English outside the native country. And what we found was the expected gradient over explicitness, so the overuse of the overt pronoun that we found in Romance languages, you know, as I said before, or languages that are null subjects. But gradient, because we also took into account the possibility of the reuse or acceptance of the repetition of the noun phrase. Rather than using a pronoun, you repeat the full noun phrase, which is the most explicit way of disambiguating, right? So, and we found that depending on how much exposure that they had to English. So the short-term exposure group tended to use more overt pronouns than the control groups, but the speakers in the long-term exposure group tended to use even more noun phrases, full noun phrases. So there was a tendency towards what I would call over-explicitness and changes in Chinese that tended to show over-explicitness. Right, let me just skip that. There are languages that don't allow null pronouns, but they have a choice of overt pronominal forms. German is one. German has a distinction between pronouns and demonstratives, okay? And the division of labor between pronouns and demonstratives is very similar to the division of labor between null pronouns and overt pronouns in a null subject language like Italian. So you see there, I won't read it for your, I want to disturb your hearing, with my bad pronunciation of German, but that means, the waiter greets the cashier, er or der, and er tends to refer to the waiter, whereas der tends to refer to the cashier. And as an effect of attrition in bilingual speakers of German, they tend to overextend the demonstrative pronoun to contexts in which you would expect a pronoun. Okay, so again, there is an asymmetric movement, that favors the most explicit form over the other, although they're both overt forms in a language like German. Yeah, and this is exactly what I said. Der tends to alternate. Sometimes it refers to the waiter, sometimes it refers to the cashier. So more variability in bilinguals. But for personal pronouns, no difference between the bilinguals and the monolinguals, because the personal pronoun in both groups tends to prefer the subject antecedent. I'll skip an accusativity because in the sake of time. Gender is another interesting area in which these phenomena have been explored. So what changes as a result of attrition, in people who have left their original linguistic environment? There are two focuses, two aspects of gender that might change. One is gender assignment, right? Is this noun feminine or masculine or neuter, if depending on the language, if the language has 2 genders or 3 genders. Or there are also gender agreement. So if you have, a noun and an adjective, do they agree with one another? And these are part of the knowledge that any speaker who has gender in their language has to master. And to cut a long story short, gender attrition in first-generation speakers creates more variability in gender assignment, but not in gender agreement. Gender agreement doesn't change, but gender assignment shows more variation, particularly for low-frequency nouns, obviously, right? There is a tendency, you may self-correct yourself, if you use the wrong gender with low-frequency words, but there is more uncertain, and assignment involves non-linguistic processing. I'll come back to this. So, for example, memory. You have to use your memory because the fact that the word for sea, mare, is masculine in Italian, but it's feminine in French, la mer, but il mare in Italian. Okay, you have to memorize this, right? So it's more vulnerable to the reduction of input that attracted speakers actually get. But no evidence in the morphosyntax of gender. There are studies on this. So violations of gender agreement, whether you are, a native speaker living in your original country or an attrited speaker who has left the original community, there is basically no difference, both from a behavioral point of view, but also from a neurological point of view. I'll skip this. So, why do we see these effects? And this is where the question becomes interesting. Because originally, we also, because we all develop over time, we only took into account when we discovered, we started studying these phenomena, we only looked at cross-linguistic influence from one language to the other, which is the natural starting point, right? Most of our original studies, not just ours, but also other people's, were on the effects of English. Guess why? The effects of English, exposure to English. So grammatical knowledge in one language is influenced by the other language, and you get transfer effects, from the second language to the first language. And originally, we distinguished, following a model that, I'm not following anymore, but we distinguished between narrow syntactic features and discourse interface features that, the narrow syntactic features don't change in attrition, but the discourse interface features do change, and the narrow syntactic features in the old models were called uninterpretable features. They tend to be preserved in language attrition, acquired in second language acquisition, whereas interpretable features that interface with discourse and pragmatics are affected by attrition. They tend to change, and they're not completely acquired in second language acquisition. So they show variability in both groups, and we call this, interface condition plus or minus topic shift. These are just names that you give to refer to these conditions, and so this condition it's specified in L1, but becomes underspecified, so more variable, due to the absence of a similar condition in the other language. So the languages we studied, were Italian and English. English doesn't have null pronouns; it's not a null subject language. Italian is. So there was a rather obvious explanation at the beginning that English, obviously English doesn't allow null pronouns. That's why, we see these effects on Italian. And so in attrited speakers, the null pronoun doesn't change, as I said, but the overt pronoun, can vary depending on whether it has this feature plus topic shift or whether it doesn't have this feature minus, or it has minus topic shift, whereas in monolingual speakers, there's a clear distinction. So more variation for the overt subject within that explanation. So we concluded then, when I say then, I say, more than 10 years ago, that the language that has the least restrictive option affects the other, regardless of whether it's the L1 or the L2, but not vice versa. So in attrition in the native language, we see a neutralization of a distinction that is operative in the language towards the less restrictive L2 system, English in this case. In second language acquisition, we see a neutralization of the L2 distinction, Italian in this case, towards a less restrictive L1 system, which is English. So this is the explanation that we had given at the beginning. However, this explanation is not very good because this overuse of the overt pronouns is shown in bilingual speakers of two languages of the same type. So both null subject languages, both languages that allow a choice between null and overt. So English is out now, and there is quite a lot of research on bilinguals of Spanish and Italian, Greek and Spanish, Spanish and European Portuguese, Spanish and Catalan, Italian and Spanish, Mayan Spanish, Spanish Basque, Italian Sardinian as well, that we studied. So it can't be just a question of transfer from one type of language to the other. What else could it be? And this is where we need interdisciplinary research. Because, so there may be another reason that is not mutually exclusive. I want this to be clear. I'm not saying that it's either a question of transfer from the other language or a processing explanation that I'm going to explain in a moment. It could be both to different degrees. So they're not mutually exclusive, but this is something that we have to take into account. So we have to take into account the integration of grammatical and contextual and pragmatic information, which is necessary in order to interpret pronominal forms correctly in real time. So not just, in a grammaticality judgment task, where you have plenty of time, but also if you use a behavioral task where you measure the timing of responses, you may find more interesting results. So according to this not completely alternative, but hypothesis, the grammar itself, is not affected. So, your grammatical knowledge, if you're a native speaker of a language, doesn't really change. What changes is the access to that knowledge. And one piece of evidence for this is that these changes are reversible. So we studied, people who were re-exposed to their original language. They moved back to their original country, and after a period of re-exposure, these phenomena regressed. Or completely disappeared, but we don't have much evidence about that. But they definitely regressed. So re-exposure has the effect of, partly reverse these changes due to attrition. We're talking about first generation speakers. So if I move back to Italy, my, access, and use of pronouns might change in ways that are not immediately obvious, but they would be obvious in a properly conducted study. And this is a paper that we did on Spanish, where we originally showed these reversal effects of re-exposure to the original language community. So this is not just a linguistic matter, but it's a matter of cognitive control, because when you use pronouns or understand pronouns, you have to be able to, you focus on one if there is a choice of two, and you have to be able to exclude the others. Okay, so you focus on one and you exclude the other in trying to map pronouns and antecedents, for example. But more importantly, you have to integrate contextual information or pragmatic information. So this is necessary in many cases to understand, what a speaker might be referring to, depending on, the contextual variables. And there are many aspects of, for example, your interlocutor's knowledge state. So if I'm talking to you, I have to be able to gauge whether what I'm referring to is equally salient for me and for you. If I'm aware that it's not salient for you, I can't drop a pronoun, because then it becomes really difficult for you to understand. So I have to use either an overt pronoun if I'm speaking Italian, or I have to repeat a full noun phrase to make it more explicit. So sharing, a knowledge of the interlocutor's knowledge stage is obviously one of the factors that plays a role. And that means, also you have to adapt your pronominal choices to where the dialogue is going, because it's unpredictable where the dialogue is going, what we're going to talk about in 5 minutes, and so on. So I have to be able to adjust my evaluation of the context to these contextual changes if I'm a cooperative interlocutor, obviously. And that means, if so far I've been dropping a pronoun, and so I've been inhibiting, the overt pronoun, I may have to reverse that. So that means I have to disengage the inhibition that I've applied to the null in order to reverse the effect. And that means also updating the discourse model all the time in ways that are unpredictable, because we can't know where the conversation or the dialogue is going. So, straightforward hypothesis, if we start taking these factors into account, maybe a bilingual speaker is not always able to do this because they don't have enough cognitive resources to do all these different things. So we know that, well, this is something that we try to explain to people also, to tell people, in our information sessions, for society, different sectors of society. In all bilinguals and multilinguals, all languages are active. So you can't switch off a language in the morning, you put it in the drawer because we don't need it today, okay? So I'm speaking English to you, my Italian is very active in my brain, as well as the other languages I know, so my brain is actively trying to push them away. So this obviously requires some cognitive resources. What if the cognitive resources then are not always sufficient to do this phenomenal use in a way that is appropriate, right? So sometimes, that's why we see variability. Sometimes there are enough cognitive resources, sometimes there aren't enough cognitive resources. And in fact, I said we can compare attrited speakers, native speakers under attrition, and non-native speakers at a very advanced level, but we find that they both converge in the same behavior, but the overextension of verb pronouns is smaller in attrited speakers than in non-native speakers. Possibly because in the second language speakers, the unwanted language that they have to inhibit, it's still their dominant L1 that needs more resources to be inhibited because it's stronger. Whereas in attrited speakers, the unwanted language is the less dominant L2, which needs fewer resources to be inhibited. Just a hypothesis on this. There is a more specific hypothesis that I hope I'm going to explain in a clear way. I said, using pronouns correctly involves gauging, evaluating the context in which, the entity you're referring to is placed, whether there is enough shared knowledge, whether you're referring to something that is salient in context or not salient. And this is collaboration with colleagues in cognitive psychology. What if there is a trade-off between ability to integrate and ability to inhibit? In a way, think about it. Inhibition means exclusion. Integration means pulling things together, okay? So this relationship has been studied, not in bilingualism, but in cognitive psychology. So there is a potential trade-off. So the stronger you are at inhibiting, the more difficult it might be to reverse the inhibition so that you can integrate information. So the better you are at inhibiting, the less good or more variable you can be at integration and updating your evaluation of the discourse context. So these trade-offs have been studied, not in bilinguals, but in several typical populations in cognitive psychology. This is the effect is called negative priming. I got completely, fascinated by this because, it really means being able to switch attention from one thing to the other and being able to, disengage inhibition when it's necessary. An example of this, what I'm talking about, is the so-called Stroop paradigm. This is a well-known cognitive test that is used both with adults and with children as well. So list A is the clearest one. So you have to say the color of the ink in which the words are written. Okay? So if you try, you don't have to spend much time, but you have to say blue, but the word says red. And you can't help reading it, right? Because we're all proficient readers. We can't switch off our reading ability, right? So, oops, there is a clash between the color that you have to name and the color that you have to read. Second, you have to say purple, but the word says yellow. Again, clash. List B is the one that is most interesting because, look, try it. You have to say green, but the word says blue, right? So you focus on green, you inhibit blue, but look at the next word. Blue is exactly the color that you have to say, which is the color that you've just inhibited in the previous trial. So people are slowed down in list B more than in list A because they have this negative priming effect. They have to disengage inhibition that they've just applied in order to focus on what they've just inhibited. Okay? We did a study with cognitive psychology comparing monolinguals and bilinguals, and we did find larger negative priming effects in bilinguals than in monolinguals. Okay, so bilinguals are better in inhibiting because they have to do it. As I said, all your languages are active, and you have to inhibit the languages or languages that you're not using. But it all depends also on the type of bilingual experience, because we know that bilingualism is very diverse. It depends on where you are. So some types of bilingual experience might actually improve the ability to update, your ability to inhibit when the situation is unpredictable and so on. So disengaging attention when, from what you were paying attention up to now, refocusing in a flexible way. But other types of learning, bilingual experience may not allow you to do that. So, for example, if you live in a multilingual community where everybody knows both languages or different languages, then you don't have to inhibit, the language or languages that you're using very strongly, because you can rely on the fact that people can understand you. Whereas if you are in a community where there is a diglossic situation where one of the languages is only used at home and the other language is only used outside the home, Sardinian is a case in point, then at home you have to strongly inhibit Italian, outside the home you have to strongly inhibit Sardinian, so these kind of effects become more visible in other situations. And you would expect a difference in this respect between late bilinguals, so adult second language learners, people who have learned another language later in life, and for whom the first language is really very strong and well established, and early bilinguals who have developed both languages or more than two languages from early childhood. So there isn't, a strong use of one of the languages over time, and the proficiency is more balanced. And as I already talked about, diglossic versus non-diglossic context. And early and late bilingualism, this is what we're talking about. So late bilingualism, in a way, involves less efficient integration, updating, modulation of attention compared to early bilingualism. This is a hypothesis that is open. It's not a firm conclusion. We need more research to prove this. And in fact, there are studies, Costa and Santesteban, for example, early proficient bilinguals that they call language switching masters, don't need to inhibit one of their languages when they use the other, because they are used to, handling both. And maybe they use a different mechanism, rather than inhibition, they use enhancement or activation of one of the languages rather than inhibition. There are also potential counter-evidence, so sign language, for example, evidence from sign language. So there is a lot of research on bimodal bilinguals. These are hearing people who can use a sign language very well. Sign languages have a different modality, so in principle, there's no need to inhibit one of the languages, right? Because they use different modality, right? So what do we see? Do we see these phenomena in bimodal bilinguals? Yes, we do actually, because, for example, Catalan speakers who learn Catalan Sign Language, these are bimodal bilinguals, they tend to produce more overt pronouns in both languages. So again, you know, these are two null subject languages, but different modalities, and yet the modality doesn't seem to matter very much. You want to know why? Well, I don't know very well, you know, so this is one of the areas that requires more research. There is also research on so-called unimodal signers. So these are deaf people who can sign in different languages. So there's no spoken language involved, same modality. So the fact that, you know, two sign languages obviously use the same modality, that would involve the same kind of inhibition that you expect in bilingual speakers of two spoken languages or more. And unimodal bilingual signers, there is a study on Emirati Sign Language and ASL, American Sign Language. They also tend to use more overt pronouns, so consistently with the results that I've talked about. And Sardinian Italian, you know, we did a study on, these are my psychology colleagues and a student of ours. We tested active Sardinian Italian bilinguals and passive Sardinian Italian bilinguals. I would qualify as a passive Sardinian Italian bilinguals because I understand it but I don't speak it. We did an eye tracking task, we did a forced judgment task, and we found a difference between active bilinguals and passive bilinguals. So we also compared Italian-English passive bilinguals, and we found that active bilinguals, yes, I mean, in online measures, you know, there was a less of a distinction between null and overt pronouns, a tendency to overuse the overt pronoun, but not in passive bilinguals. So that's another characteristic of the bilingual experience that we need to take into account. And ultimately, what we're talking about is an adaptive cognitive control system. Depending on your bilingual experience, your cognitive control system adapts in particular ways. So, you know, in dual language contexts, such as Catalonia, for example, where Spanish and Catalan, you know, you can rely on the fact that they are understood, you know, by most people. There is less inhibition, more switching. Single language contexts like Sardinia, you know, the two languages are very separate. More inhibition is necessary, as we said before, and less switching. So again, the type of bilingual experience needs to be considered. And ultimately, what we want to say is that there are efficient bilingual adaptations. So, you know, I mentioned the trade-offs, you know, basically, you know, there is a tendency towards communication efficiency in bilinguals depending on the experience. And ultimately, and this is the last point, there is a tendency to be explicit or over-explicit, which is very interesting. As I said, there is no confusion, there is no tendency to use a null pronoun when it's not appropriate. There is a tendency to use an overt pronoun where you would expect a null. So why is that? It is possible that bilinguals have a higher threshold for salience because they are aware of ambiguity, because they are aware of being misunderstood. So they are over-explicit. They produce fewer reduced forms because they have this, you know, higher threshold for deciding when to drop a pronoun. They are, you know, more aware of ambiguity, better at perspective taking. This is another subfield of research. You know, bilingual children understand earlier than a monolingual child that it is possible to have a different point of view, a different perspective from your own. And that is the bilingual experience first, because a bilingual child understands very quickly that not everybody is bilingual. So they have to choose the right language depending on who they're talking to, which involves understanding the other person's linguistic perspective. And this is generalized outside the language experience and leads to a better understanding that it is possible to have a different point of view and a different perspective. Now, I could go on for half an hour, you know, saying, because people ask me at this point, oh, but that makes them better people, right? And I say, well, you know, in principle, yes, but it's also possible, you know, perspective taking is not necessarily the same as empathy. Okay? Perspective taking is a basis for empathy, maybe, but, you know, can also be the basis of, if I understand what hurts you most, I can hurt you better. So we hope that, you know, this is, but anyway, this is another. So bilingual speakers, you know, might use the redundant form, the over-explicit form as a default, but also because they have a higher sensitivity to the other person's perspective, higher threshold for salience. They worry that something may be ambiguous, you know, and so they are over-explicit. And in comprehension, you know, they may be over-explicit, you know, so misinterpret the pronoun because they miss the cue that signals a shift in reference, but also they might attribute to the speaker the same, you know, over-informativeness that is characteristic of their own production. So, I'm almost finished, you'll be pleased to say. So, we are talking about the convergence between what we see in attrition in first-generation speakers and what we see in advanced stages of second language acquisition of the same language. Residual variability in advanced second language speakers and emerging variability in first native language speakers perhaps tends to affect aspects of processing rather than knowledge representations, and in attrition we know that these changes are at least partly reversible, so it's not a drastic change in your knowledge of grammar, but it might be a change in the way you access the grammar in real time. So one of the hypotheses that we can make is that emerging optionality is it's a technical term, variability, I tend to prefer variability these days, and changes tend to affect only aspects of processing, but not your knowledge, actual knowledge of grammar. But then again, you know, in second generation speakers, we might also see changes in grammatical representations in the way knowledge is acquired, because it depends on what children do with the variation that they hear in parental input, in learning the heritage language from speakers who are experiencing attrition. So the hypothesis that we're making at the moment is that there is an ecosystem, so that, you know, learning a language successfully as an adult might actually involve selective changes in your native language, and a convergence between L1 and L2 that is functional to your becoming a proficient bilingual, late bilinguals. So that means, among many other things, that proficient bilinguals are not like monolinguals in any language. So if we take it this seriously, you know, how many unchanged monolinguals are there in the world, in today's world, right? There are studies about the effects of passive exposure to multilingual communities that show effects on the brain. There was a famous study where they compared Americans who define themselves as monolingual, living in California in a multilingual environment, and monolingual Americans in central Pennsylvania, okay, which is a less multilingual environment. So all these people said, no, I don't speak any other language, I'm only English, I'm monolingual, and so on. But then they were tested, and the monolinguals in California had different brain reactions from the monolinguals in Pennsylvania. They heard languages that they didn't consciously understand, but that passive exposure actually had an effect. What we want to say is that, in conclusion, languages affect each other. And this is an absolutely normal phenomenon. It doesn't mean that you lose your language. And this is something that, we have to explain also to general audiences, right? I mean, your child, doesn't, lose out, they don't learn well English because they have another home language. The home language doesn't suffer because your child is learning another language. But, the two languages affect each other in specific ways. So, in predictable, in selective ways. There are similar areas of optionality or variation in first language changes, in attrition, and in second language attainment, which are more or less visible depending on the kind of bilingual experience. One big consequence of this is that we shouldn't expect multilinguals, bilinguals to behave like the sum of two monolinguals, okay? And unfortunately, this is the philosophy that underlies many practices in our societies, both practices of teaching, practices of classroom, regarding, what multilinguals can do. A bilingual is not the sum of two monolingual natives, and we have evidence that actually shows that, and we need more evidence by joining the dots, and that means doing research not just on language, but other cognitive and social domains, and different subfields of research, language learning, language, bilingualism, different populations. And we need to connect research and society. Finished. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Sorace. Stay here.
Oh,
I want to have a conversation with you.
I thought I had to stand there, and leave you the space.
Yeah, so a lot of information, a lot of findings, but
Yes.
at the end we all got a takeaway messages.
It's been a long day.
We don't have a lot of time left, I guess, so I'll try to be brief in my understanding of your talk today. As I was listening to her talk today, I found myself constantly contextualizing the findings that she has from many, many studies in my own life as a Korean speaker who learned English as an adult, who lives in an English-speaking country, in a home where both languages are spoken, with a slight more preference to English with my son, but maybe more Korean with my husband. I also teach Korean in an English-speaking institution, and sometimes feeling of a little bit alienated when I go back to Korea, especially. I think that's the point. I can go on and on and on, and I'm sure a lot of you feel very similar ways about your life as a language users, one or more, right? So I think our bilingual experiences are diverse and unique. However, I often observe this common sentiment among bilingual speakers, especially like my close friends or Korean late bilingual speaker communities in the US, that they speak zero native language. Because they feel that their English is not good enough, but their Korean is also, they are losing their Korean, they feel like, right? So this negative sentiment for their own experiences as bilingual speakers, and I see some students nodding their heads, and we are all together in this sentiment to some degree, I think. But then your message today, I think you showed us the new picture, right? That we don't have to consider L1 attrition in terms of loss, right? That's a very relevant and powerful message to a lot of us, I think, whether you are monolingual speakers or bilingual speakers. So she showed us that these changes, by the way, it's not the grammar, but the processing that is affected and changed. And I think I was like, yay! Because these changes can be reversible with exposure, and that's good news for us, right? And she showed that bilingual speakers adapt their systems to be more redundant for the other person, the other interlocutors in conversations. It's for the benefits of the others, right? It's not that we don't have enough resources with the perfect system, linguistic system. So I think that made all of us here feel a little bit better about us as bilingual speakers. And I was really amazed to see how these scientific research results that were obtained from very carefully done experiments can be translated into these relevant and powerful messages to a lot of us today. So it actually has prompted me personally to rethink who is monolingual and who is bilingual speakers. I often have to compare in my own work, compare two different groups, monolingual.
Oh, I know. Oh, yes, we've all done
we
that.
have to involve lots of statistical tactics to consider individual variabilities. Deep down, I feel like I have relied on this concept that monolinguals are the reference point when we make a
Most research on bilingualism has relied on that idea.
Right,
Let's say
but
it.
I find more and more evidence that even in this most homogeneous monolingual speakers that I was able to find show a lot of variability in my phonology and phonetics work. And I'm pretty sure it's the same in other areas. So I would like to end this. I'm going to make it short and invite everybody else here in the audience to ask questions, comment on what you learned today for our speaker here, and then you can stay.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. Oh, yeah.
So I found it really interesting when you talked about how the alterations are reversible if you kind of reintegrate back to that native society. But like, given this is kind of a two-part question, but given that our modern age, we have a lot of bilingual speakers constantly going back and forth between their native country, is that still applicable, or by reimmersion do we completely having integrated that?
No, I mean, this is one open question, right? Because, we did a study, we did a couple of studies, so we need more studies about, we're not talking about people who moved back to their original country for good. We're talking about, relatively short visits even, So the people we studied, in the Spanish study, went back to Spain for Christmas. So they were back there for 2 weeks, right? And we tested them before they left, and then immediately after they came back. So that was a very short period. We need more research about what happens, in the longer term, if somebody moves back to the original country.
The reason I asked was because it made me think about how, I was wondering if, you've seen any research, or if there's any research suggesting that people's socioeconomic status is associated with degree to, again, how much the altercations go. Let's say someone was in a higher socioeconomic status and is able to go back and forth much more. Are they in a privileged position to be able to retain more of their original language, or is that kind of?
I can't give you an answer to that. That's another variable, that we need to investigate. So yeah, I mean, does social status, affect? I think it probably does, but it also affects the use of the language, in the after migration, right? So, and this relates to, your presentation as well. I mean, we find in our public engagement work that higher status families are more likely to keep their home language, and they are more willing to continue to use it with their children compared to lower status families who are more afraid, that their child may not integrate, they may not learn enough English, and so on. So, but we definitely need more research that integrates that variable as well. Yes. Oh, sorry.
Talk about the language, the switch masters, and they do not require much inhibition for whatever reason. They're allowed to switch between the languages. So, what are those mechanisms that they are not relying on and other people drawing on?
Sorry, are you talking about? I missed the beginning of your.
Did you call them switch masters, language switch masters, or?
You mean the Chinese study where, no?
No, I thought you referred to them as switch masters. Fully bilingual, who move between languages, don't require to inhibit one of.
Oh, the people who live in, I mean.
So those people are using language mechanisms that are in some way different from somebody who doesn't have that.
This has been suggested, by, as I said, my, dear ex-colleague and friend Albert Costa, who died a few years ago, and he did a study about, suggesting that inhibition may not be the mechanism that these people are using, because the frequency with which they have to move from one language to the other, perhaps requires enhanced activation of a language rather than inhibition of the other. But yeah, we need more research on this. It's a very interesting question.
First of all, I learned a lot, so thank you so much. I'm particularly excited to hear that some of the things could be because of the discourse context, right, the pragmatics. So as a discourse communication person, I would say, here's my opportunity. I want to understand how these kinds of things, what's the impact of the conversational sequential conditions, the participation structure, what kinds of taking obligations of the rights, and the context of things that we observe could have an impact, and also impact these features perhaps a little differently, because things like pronominal reference looks like more contextual, as you said, but gender marking to me is more arbitrary. Right? So if we say, well, does discourse context impact these kinds of language forms differently? That would be very interesting to find out. Right? Maybe I can see how it impacts pronominal reference, but this gender marking business or number for that matter, right? A lot of features, morphological features, for example, that are absent in Mandarin Chinese. What is this for an impact at all? So I'm just dying to know the answers.
Yeah, sorry if I didn't want to suggest that it's the same kind of discourse, integration that is necessary for pronominal references and gender, right? I mean, there are other cognitive processes that are involved. I mentioned memory for gender, for example. In Italian, for example, we have some words, that could be either masculine or feminine, depending with different meanings and different contexts, right? So that involves, memory, and that's another cognitive ability that is involved, in using these forms in an appropriate, correct way. And it's not necessarily the same as the integration abilities that are involved in using a pronoun or switching from one pronoun to the other in an appropriate way. So again, we need more research. So I'm aware that, I was actually, presenting more open questions, than real, conclusions. But that's the beauty of research, right? Research moves on all the time, research is never the truth, which is interesting also from the public engagement point of view, right? Because, we want to communicate research, but we don't want to present research as if this is the truth, right? Research moves on, so we can make generalizations that are very well founded, right? But we always need more research to refine. So does that mean mean that we shouldn't do public engagement? This is a very interesting open question, because I've discussed, with other researchers, not just in Britain, but all over the world, and there are people who say, we don't know enough. What are we going to tell the general audience? Why should we? How can we actually say something sensible given that research moves on all the time and we are always in a position where we don't know enough? And I disagree with that. I think that, yes, it's true that research moves on all the time. It's true that, we always need more research, and that's absolutely normal. But it doesn't mean that we can't make generalizations that are useful in the non-academic world. So I strongly disagree. I have colleagues, who just don't want to do this because who am I, to say talk about things that we don't fully understand? What does it mean, fully understanding? Obviously, we're always in that position, but we can still. I think the link between research and society is still a very valid one that benefits not only general audiences. So we're not just the wise people who communicate our wisdom, to non-academics. We learn a lot. We learn a lot by doing it.
I always love listening to you, Antonella. It always feels like when I'm listening to somebody speaking from, within linguistics, it's a bit like being a kind of passive bilingual. I can't like talking, pronominal, whatever it was. But I understand exactly what it means, particularly when you put it up in German. So it's quite an interesting experience across interdisciplinary boundaries, and the work and the adaptation that I think we're all doing to one another's ways of speaking within different disciplinary areas. But I was translating it in my head into anthropology. I was really interested in that brilliant sentence you used about explicitness and the higher threshold of salience, and that use of explicitness. And again, I was thinking, like you were, in myself, I do this. I know I do this. I do it in English with non-native speaking of English. Terrible words, I know, but it's what we use. Those adaptations you make to change and slow down how you speak, and so it's not the English I learned at home, and I do it in German and French and Portuguese and other languages. But I was then thinking about the context in Africa where I work, anthropologically, where I'm noticing patterns of behaviour and things people are saying. And one of the things said regularly to me is, and around me, is the way that people translate ideas. So they will say regularly, but in my language we say this. And it's a constant repetition of a phrase, which sounds like teaching. When I first heard it, I thought, this is a really bad way of teaching, because no one's going to understand or remember this way of speaking about something. But it really resonates with what you're saying here about these higher levels of salience. That what you're dealing with in contexts which are highly multilingual, socially and culturally, is a pattern of adaptability around higher levels of salience. And so basically, what I was wondering whether in interdisciplinary terms, what you're saying from the point of view of cognitive psychology might also work within anthropological contexts and the way we can adapt more generally within it.
Absolutely, and that would be, I don't see why not.
It would be a great research project.
Absolutely. Let's join forces and let's work together. Right.
We have a reception right outside this building.
Oh.
It's all just right
across the next mission. So,
Maria, thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for